The purpose of this video is to allow you to share in the experience of constructing your own set of Zenair Amphibious floats. These popular floats are now available in kit form, which provides a substantial savings in cost, making them affordable for almost any budget. Watch over our shoulder in this presentation as we build a float and explain each step of the way. You can then come to your own conclusion that these are both fun and easy to build. Although we are building the amphibious version of the Zenair floats, the straight or non-wheeled version is similar in construction with even fewer steps to complete. It should be obvious when watching which steps do not apply to the non-wheeled straight float model. Also, we are building the 1,450-pound model. Other models of floats will have slightly different dimensions and components. Do not use the procedures in this video presentation as a substitute for your plans when building your floats. Features are constantly changing, and what you see here may not be applicable to your model. This video is not a substitute for your plans. It's simply a documentary of how we built our floats. Your floats will probably have some improvements that were not available when we built ours. We are independent builders and are not associated with Zenair, the float manufacturer. Let's get started. No doubt your floats will arrive in a large wooden crate. It is important that you unpack and inspect each component carefully and check it off against the master pick list. Many of the components will come in pairs as you are building a set of floats. Some parts have a left and a right, others are identical between the two floats. The bulkheads are an important part of the float as it gives it shape. They come in all different sizes and are labeled accordingly. On the floor is one of the pre-bent bottom skins. The roll of aluminum makes up the main outer skin of the float. Here are some of the components for the amphibious version, the wheels. These would not be included if you were building a non-wheeled or straight float. There will certainly be plenty of rivets, but the good news is that these are aluminum and pop or pulled rivets, very easy to install. One of the most common and useful tools you will use building your float will be the long drill bit. This is a size 40, very small, and we will use the silver cleco whenever we make a hole in this. But because of the flexibility of this bit, we'll be able to get into some pretty tight areas. And it will last a long time drilling into aluminum, but if you have a couple of these, you'll be in very good shape, and you'll see it used throughout the building of the float. One of our first tasks is to create the cradle supports using a sheet of plywood and carefully drawing out our template to be cut. Now you want to use your plans for the correct dimensions, but I have 16 inches from top to bottom and 24 inches across approximately. And then we will use our number 6 bulkhead, and using a straight line, a center line, to help us locate the bulkhead properly. And then we will trace the shape, and we will then cut this out. We will then need to duplicate this 6 times. And here's the first one we cut out. It looks something like this. Now, as per our instruction manual, we also want to make a cutout down here at the bottom for the channel that may go through here. And there's our cutout. Now we need to go ahead and make 5 more of these for a total of 6, and I'll continue to lay them out and cut them. My center line here makes it easy to find the center and the center at the bottom when lining these up. Now we have all 6 of them cut. Our next step is to add a 2x4 on the back so that they stand up like this. So I just screwed in a couple of wood screws so that they would stand by themselves, and I'll repeat that for all 6 of them. Now we want to assemble or procure a table that we want to set all of our cradles on. You can use a 2x4 on edge for the full length of the table. We have obviously used something much taller than that, and that is not required. 2x4 can certainly provide enough stiffness. We do want it to be the full 14 to 16 foot length of your tabletop size. This table needs to be at least 24 inches across and preferably a little bit wider, but that would be the minimum. Mine is 16 feet long, but you could get by with as little as 14 feet, so somewhere in the 14 to 16 foot range. The length of the float is 14.5 feet. And of course we want to be able to accommodate a cradle near each end of that 14.5 foot length that we're going to be working with. Keeping our total length of 14.5 feet in mind, we want to space out our cradles so that the end ones are something less than 14.5 feet, let's say about 14 feet apart, and then the remaining 4 in between equally spaced out from each of those ends. We can then use a screw in each of the ends of the supports to hold the cradles down to the table to keep them from moving. Looking at the top of the supports, you will notice I added a rail, a 2x3, on both sides and attached it with screws. I didn't have a piece long enough, so I used a splice in the middle to join them. In order to support this nicely, I added another 2x3 or 2x4 to the edge. I did this in about 3 places, one at the end, one at the other end, to help support that. Here's a look down the center. Notice we set those top shelves way over, and the reason for that is when the metal sits in here, we don't want it to interfere with this, so we move this over so that there be no interference when that comes in. And that's why we offset this a bit to the outside. And I did screw them down to the table, but note that the screws I used were towards the end of the support so that I can get at them and remove those screws while the metal skin is in place, so that we can move these around for proper alignment. So you don't want to screw them down too good. You want to be able to unscrew them as necessary for shifting them left and right as needed later. Our first step is to lay the large 4x12 sheet on the ground. I've put some cardboard backing behind mine. And then right next to it, our shorter sheet. We now want to draw a center line lengthwise down the middle as accurately as we can. We'll grab a long straight edge and a marker and create our center line through both pieces. Now that we have our center line in place, we need to start marking the stations as per your directions. And I'm going to start from the front, or the left in this case, measuring from the very front edge. And these measurements will be in millimeters from our plans. Notice I have marked each of the stations along the center line, and I have also labeled the station number so I can go back and verify. When we come to the end of the sheet, we then need to take a moment and notice on our directions I need a 60 millimeter line from the edge of our small sheet, and drew that all the way from top to bottom, because that is going to be the amount of overlap. In other words, I'm going to slide the short sheet underneath the large sheet up to that 60 millimeter line. And then, and only then, can I continue marking the stations. Now we want to use something like this drywall T-square to create our very accurate lines that will cross at each of the stations we marked with a very accurately drawn purple. That way this line that we draw will represent the stations we marked very precisely, and we will draw these lines at each of the stations on the sheet. And now we have all of the stations marked with our perpendicular lines. Now, as we come to the seam, let's take a closer look. We have our smaller skin, or the rear skin, set underneath by our 60-degree offset. And we have our station for FL 9.5 marked. And using your directions, notice that we have two more rivet lines. One line is 10 millimeters from the edge of the large skin. Overlap these skins using these lines and drill just a couple holes at each end and cleco them together to affix the two skins together. And then we continued drawing the stations all the way to the very end of our rear skin, the smaller skin. And notice the last station is 10 millimeters from the edge of the small rear skin at 4490. Our final step then is to drill a single hole at the intersection of each of the stations and the center line. Used a number 40, and this will help locate our bulkheads when we first install them. We now proceed to place the skin using additional manpower onto our jig. Okay, and then using a 2x4,
Look at that.
it will fall right into place.
Now we got to get him straight.
Now, we want to prepare our bulkheads by providing an accurate vertical line right down the center. Now, one way I found to do that was to take a piece of cardboard and using my T-square, make a very accurate 90-degree cross. And that way, I could take each bulkhead and line it up carefully such that the lines intersect the center and the corners, and that way, all the way at the bottom, we could find the accurate center and mark it on the flange. So we'll move this back and forth until we have it lined up with our lines. And the point of all of that is to be able to draw then the accurate vertical line down the middle. We want to do this to each of our bulkheads. Actually, the only bulkheads I'm going to work with at this time is number 1, 4, 6, 9, and 11. Those 5. Another thing we want to do is to draw a center line along the flange using our marker. Then we're going to drill a number 40 size hole at our center location, and then every 25 millimeters spacing with the number 40 hole, and of course that will be between the crimps all the way up to the very end. So I have to go ahead and drill those holes. And again, I'm going to do this at the moment now on just bulkhead number 1, 4, 6, 9, and 11. Now here is bulkhead FL4. Notice that I have marked along the center line and spaced my rivet locations at the top or in between each of the crimps at the very top level area, and those are approximately 25 millimeters apart, and then continued that spacing all the way along to the corner on both sides. And I drilled this with a number 40 drill bit, and I will continue to do this with the rest of the bulkheads. I can then install this, if I want, into our skin, because we do have drilled the center hole in the bottom of the skin. We'll drill the rest of these after we plumb everything up and get it nice and level. And when we're done drilling the flanges, we can insert them at the proper location as marked, using only the center cleco at the very bottom. Now we have bulkheads number 1, 4, 6, 9, and 11 installed. And by using the vertical lines on the bulkhead faces, we're going to ensure that everything is rigged properly. We're going to remove the rails on each side and unscrew the wooden saddles so that we can shift the skin as necessary. We'll first try and get the front end, number 1, and the back end, number 11, aligned vertically, and then check the center bulkheads and adjust the cradles as necessary to get them all perfectly vertical. By using a level, you can verify the accuracy of how vertical the lines are on each bulkhead. It's very easy to make adjustments by simply moving the cradle a little more to the left or to the right. And as you verify each bulkhead, slightly shifting these will bring your line into true vertical. Now you want to check the other end also. I verified the ends first and then worked towards the middle. But eventually, it's not too difficult to get them all nice and true. And at that stage, you want to lock down the cradles, and then we'll replace the long runners on each end and tack down the skin to those runners so that nothing moves. One of the easiest ways to get things lined up and nice and true and straight is to shift the skin down and up from either or both sides, and that will of course tilt things ever so slightly. Once it's done, we want to kind of tack the skin in place so it doesn't move on us anymore, and that's where we drilled a screw into the side. Now notice that's part of the skin that will be part that we get cut off, because this is the height of the skin at that location. And so at each of the 4 corners, I screwed the skin into our runners along the edge. Just want to make sure that we don't choose a spot that will be into the float area itself. So I have the runners screwed back on and the saddles all screwed down to the bench so that things are pretty vertical at this stage, and that we can now begin drilling the flanges through our pre-drilled holes into the skin. With our bulkhead level, we can start drilling or back drilling from the inside, starting at the bottom. Every second hole is fine, looking for our line along the skin that we drew previously, and carefully drilling through and clecoing as we go, making sure that we keep that line visible through all of the holes as we drill up the side. And of course we'll repeat this for each of the bulkheads. We can use a very long drill bit or an angle drill to make sure we get a nice straight hole into the side skin. After all the holes are drilled for our 5 bulkheads, we can move on now to insert the rest of the bulkheads that were in between. And we'll use the same technique. We will pre-drill them first on their flanges, drawing a center line, and then start at the bottom center, attach it to the skin, and then work through our pre-drilled holes from the bottom up, making sure as we drill that we keep the flange right in line with our line so we can see that line through the holes as we drill. Also, make sure you review your instructions to understand the direction of the flanges, because the bulkhead flanges at the front of the float face the opposite direction from those flanges at the back of the float. As all of your flanges on the bulkheads require that rivet locations be marked, we often use our rivet fan, which is a wonderful device for providing very consistent marking of whatever pitch distance is required along a given distance. All the bulkheads installed. And looking from the rear. As a side note, one of the important goals is to ensure that all of the bulkheads are aligned as perfectly vertical as possible. In other words, looking down the float, you should be able to see the points all lined up in a row. So before drilling any holes, do your best to make sure the bulkheads are all aligned as best you can. For our next step, we have removed bulkhead FL6 and FL8. We want to mark the center line and then 2 parallel lines 145 millimeters apart from the center line for a total of 290 millimeters from top to the bottom. Now let's go back and reinstall these two. We're looking at bulkhead FL8, which has been reinstalled after carefully marking the vertical lines that are 145 off of the center. So we have them 290 degrees apart. Now we can take our wheel well FL51 and install that. Now the flanges will point inward, and I'm just going to insert this in here. The shorter end is towards bulkhead FL8. FL6 is behind me here. And I'm simply going to put this in place up to the line we drew and all the way up to the top here. And it will look something like that. And of course, we're going to want to pre-drill the flanges on 3 sides, the bottom and both ends, to our pitch 20 as per our directions with size number 40 holes, so we can drill them into the bulkheads. Here's a look at the other side. Now we have to line that up precisely with our drawn line. And of course the bottom flange goes all the way to the top skin. Remember, we have the float inverted. And here's a view from the other side. And of course the other side panel will go in a similar fashion on the other side. I'm going to go ahead and mark and pre-drill 3 sides of these panels. Here I have the panel hanging on the edge of a table, and I first drew a center line down the flange. And although we are showing that these holes should be drilled at this time, in reality, it is best to wait until we install other components that will share these mounting hole locations. Later in this video, this will make more sense as we show mounting other assemblies to the bulkheads that intersect the side panel flanges. We will drill these holes at that time. Here we have the panel in place. Notice I have it clamped at the short end and lined up at our vertical line. And now we can drill into the flange and into the bulkhead, also down on the bottom skin, or actually top skin in this case, and then the flange on the other side. So we will get it from 3 sides, making sure that we keep the panel aligned with the vertical line we drew on both bulkheads. We can now proceed to install the other side. And again, we're just going to line it up with our line and clamp it in place with the top flange of FL8 bulkhead. And when we have a good fit, we can go ahead and drill the flanges just like we did before. Now we're going to move to the nose wheel. Now I have removed bulkhead number 1, and on bulkhead number 2 we want to draw 2 parallel lines 100 millimeters from the center, so they're 200 millimeters apart, and the same thing on the back side of bulkhead number 1, 200 millimeters from one end to the other. Then we can put this back in place. We're going to install FL50, same principle. The flanges will go inward, and we'll mount this so that they're even with our lines on both sides. And so we first need to prepare the flanges with our proper pitch, drill them with drill size 40, just like we did before. Here is an example where the right tool for the job happens to be an angle drill. This is available from your aircraft supply store. Just about any other combination of a drill or drill bit just won't fit or allow us to get into these very tight quarters. Now we're going to install the step angle. This is FL36. And we're actually going to install two of them together, separated by a 25,000th piece of aluminum skin in between. But basically, what we want to do is measure from the top of our wheel well to the top of the bulkhead right here. I measured from this surface here to the flange here, and then I want to use that measurement to create a line all the way down to the edge of the skin, because that's going to be the location of the angle. We can place our angle, going to go right like this. It'll sit right on top there. Now it's a little bit longer, so I will trim it off so it's even with the edge there. Here's how I prepared the angle for drilling. On the wide flange, I drew two lines, one about 10 millimeters in, and then the other one I split the difference to the end, drew them all the way across. And up on the small flange, a line all the way across. Now we're supposed to have 20 millimeter rivet spacing here, so I laid out my 20 millimeters going across. Down here on these lines, same thing, except notice I staggered them so that one starts off slightly than the other, but the spacing going all the way across is 20 millimeters. Now, I have it all drilled. We want to take our matching piece, put it on top or put it below, and we want to drill through into the other piece. However, we first want to place a scrap piece of aluminum. Needs to be 25 thou, maybe 32 thou, in between. So we're going to sandwich our scrap piece in between on the large flange, clamp this together, and then drill through all of our holes. The purpose for this is that these two angles are going to provide the location for the skin when we slip it in. And the scrap piece will hold these apart at just the right amount. And you can see the small gap here. So I'm going to take the bottom piece and use that for now when I'm fitting it up to the bulkhead. And then we'll put the top one back on when we're all done and cleco that in place. So we'll install this right here, and we'll follow our line on the bottom edge. And I'll clamp this in place and drill it to the bulkhead. Now I have clecoed this from the back just to make it easier to see. And we can then take the clamp off. And then we can set our other piece after drilling through all of the holes and set that on top to see what that looks like. When our skin goes in, it will go in between these and then get riveted through our holes that we pre-drilled. We're going to repeat this procedure on the other side using the same technique. In preparation for installing the rear bottom skin, make a mark. Now we're looking at the back end of FL6, our bulkhead, and we need to make a line that will help us out a little bit later. Here's another angle a little bit easier to see. The line on the left is the original rivet line for the bulkhead flange. The new line we need to make right now, the one on the right, represents not the edge of the bulkhead, but the radius where it begins to bend, and we want to make a line there. That's going to represent the edge of our back bottom skin. So on both sides we need to draw a line, not to the edge of our bulkhead, but to where the radius, or where it begins to bend, which is back towards the left a little bit from the edge. We're looking at the small end of the rear bottom skin. The other end is wider, so we want to make sure we have the narrow end. This will go at the very back end of the float. And we need to true up this back edge. If we take a square, we will notice that lining up the edge and the very corner right here, we notice that the back edge is not square. So we need to take a marker and mark that carefully so that we can remove this piece, because we want a 90-degree edge to meet at a common point at this center right here. So I'll draw a line both sides and remove that with my snips. It is best to remove bulkhead 6 while fitting the skin on. Now I moved the rear of the skin so that it was even with the outer skin, right at the rear. And I checked to make sure this was set this way on both sides. The edge here is even, the edge of the skin. And then I clamped them in place, each of the corners, so that nothing would move. We'll end up trimming the other end of this bottom skin. Now we're going to transfer each of the flange lines of the bulkhead to the bottom skin. In other words, I will use a straight edge and make this line down on the flange here, and continue that for all of the center line flange of the bulkheads all the way up the float. On both sides. With the flange marked, the idea is then to use a square so that we can draw the rivet line that we will end up using to drill into the flange of the bulkheads. And we'll draw these on both sides for all of the bulkhead flange rivet lines. Now we're up at bulkhead number 6, and if we look at these two vertical lines, The one on the right is the one we marked previously, which was the radius edge of the flange of bulkhead 6. And I've extended it down all the way to the flange of our bottom skin. Here's the line drawn with a 90-degree square. And that's the area we will remove because that will become the front of the rear bottom skin. And on the other side, and we have now drawn the rivet lines for the bulkhead flanges. And we will use these to lay out the rivet locations. We do need to mark a no rivet zone along the very corner in the middle of the keel. Next, we want to take the rear keel, FL34. It's this long piece with the angled end. We want to place it right on the corner and even with the end here. And we'll just leave it loose, sitting on the corner, going up as far as it can go. And right here is the line for bulkhead 14.5. And what we want to do at that location is take our gusset, which is FA35, and place it right on top of the keel so its front edge is approximately at the rivet line of 14.5. Here's another look from above. Notice we have the gusset sitting on top of the keel. Now the reason for doing this is we want to take our pen and outline the edge of the keel all the way along the bottom skin, and also outline the gusset, FA35, also. I have used my marker and outlined this. I will now remove. This outline indicates the area for our no rivet zone. So as we are laying out our rivets along the flange lines on the bottom skin, we don't want to cross this line and drill any holes, because those holes will be located later when the keel is installed and when the gusset is installed. We can now remove the bottom skin so that we can mark the top flanges of the bulkheads. With the bottom skin removed, our next step is to mark center lines on all of the flanges of the bulkheads. Now, with the bottom skin on top of a table, we want to lay out the rivet holes along the lines we drew. We will check our plans for the proper rivet spacing on the bottom skin. Now, my plan said pitch 30. You should check yours. I have my rivet fan, which allows me to adjust this to any size I want to. So I'm going to use a ruler and set this up so that there is 30 between each finger. So now I have this spaced for 30. Here's the line, for example, that I want to set my rivet spacing to. If it turns out that I can't fit them evenly, see how this one is a little too close. Now remember, this is our no rivet zone where the keel is, so we don't want to put a rivet anywhere in here or touching the line, of course. I can certainly push this in and make it a little narrower, and that will make it very consistent across, so that I can get one here and one down here, not in the very corner, but away about 8 to 10 millimeters. And now I have my pitch 30, a little bit less, but it's at least consistent going all the way across. And that's the same process I'll go through when I move to the next flange, is try and make it fit, and if not, squeeze it in a little bit, or I could squeeze it out just a little bit to get a nice consistent fit and very close to my pitch 30. So I will continue this on both sides for all of my flanges. Now I have put the skin so that the corner is on the edge of the table, leaning over, and this will allow us to drill, if you don't mind drilling into your table, at all of the locations that you have marked, and you'll be drilling down flat into the table. And of course on the other side also. And we'll flip this up over the other side of the table when we're ready to drill the other half. Once our holes are drilled, we want to create a cutout for the large wheel. So we need to create a cutout in the large end of the bottom skin. And our first cut is going to be a very rough one. It will be undercut, so we don't have to worry about getting it right. I have marked 4 inches from the center on the edge on both sides. 4 inches there and 4 inches over there. And then back at our bulkhead number 8, I did the same thing. I marked 4 inches from the center along bulkhead 8 rivet line, and then connected those lines. So I have a rectangle which is 8 inches wide. Now we don't want to cut all the way to the rivet line of bulkhead 8, so I moved out an inch, and that shortened our rectangle by an inch at bulkhead 8 rivet line. So we're going to cut out this rectangle, and you can verify by looking at your float that this is where the wheel well is located. And after we cut this out, we'll put it in place and then get an exact dimension by tracing to get a very nice fit. So this is just the rough cut. I will be using my large scissors-like shears, and as you cut, you will notice because of the bend in the skin, it is very hard for the skin to peel. So by cutting on the center crease and then working back and forth, it makes it much easier to cut the skin out. The large hole makes it much easier to get the shears in from both angles to remove this piece. Here's an example of some unibits, trade name, that will allow us to drill very nicely very large holes into sheet metal. It's a step bit. Each step on the bit is a different diameter. With the slot cut out, we can now attack the final cut of the edge that we had marked previously. That will make it easier on both sides. Prior to putting our bottom skin back on, we want to reinstall our bulkhead number 6. Put that into place. We can take the brackets out. It may make it a little easier to get the skin in. And then after installing the bulkhead, I install just the bottom bracket of the pair. And the skin, when we install it, will go on top of that bottom bracket. And here's what the skin should look like. And notice our rough cut opening. And notice how the ends fit nicely. And we can place the upper bracket on top of each side when we're ready. Now our next step is to reach underneath this opening and trace with a pen to get the exact outline of what we need to cut off to match the flanges of the wheel well. If we look underneath the lip, we can see where the flange is located. And we just need to trace under there and then remove the skin and cut for a nice fit on the 3 sides. And here's our skin removed and upside down on the table, and we can see the trace mark, and we just need to trim that nicely. And after we cut, use our file to make a nice smooth edge. Where the right angles meet where we're about to cut out, we want to drill a relief hole, or else file a smooth round notch after we do the cutting. But this way it prevents any cracks from forming, because when we have right angles, there's a very high stress concentration, and this will help avoid cracks from forming. And there's the wheel well with the bottom skin trimmed. When you have things set up the way you want, we're going to want to look for the flange of the bulkheads through our pre-drilled holes. And we can begin drilling into the flanges when we see the center line through them. I'll start at the top and work my way down, clecoing as I go. And up front here, we can put the top half of our L angle on and drill into the front of the skin. To make it easier to work on our bottom skin, we want to trim away the side skin. So I'm going to use a ruler to draw a long line parallel with the lip of our bottom skin. And this will be a rough cut to remove the large portion which we aren't going to use anyhow. So I will use that line to remove that skin and it'll be much easier when drilling our bottom skin. Once again, I'm going to use the large scissors-like shears. You can also use more conventional snips. Prior to putting the bottom skin on for drilling, I want to show how I dealt with a problem. One is that the upper part of my bulkhead, it has a flex in it, and that makes it a little hard to find, to align, to get the line to show up in our pre-drilled holes on the skin that's going on top. So I fed a wire through the tooling holes and put a little piece of scrap metal on the end and fed them through all the tooling holes all the way to the end. What that allows me to do is to pull on the wire at the end of the float and allow me to adjust this with the skin on until I find the line so I can drill it very precisely. Now I can feed another wire for the next bulkhead, etc., and feed them all out through the tooling holes all the way to the end of the float. Wires will exit here, and I'll just pull on them gently while I have another person look through the holes in the skin. And I'll have a separate wire for each one of the bulkheads that I'm trying to control this with. Once we have located some of the center holes in the flanges, we can then continue drilling the rest of the flanges of the bulkheads from the center down towards the sides at our marked hole locations. Here we have the bottom rear skin hanging on its lip on the side of a table and then clamped at each end to keep it from falling off. Our purpose here is to mark and drill the holes in the lip. Now, according to my plans, they had to be pitch 20, which is relatively close. So I drew a center line and then used my fan tool to help come up with the pitch 20. And now I can go ahead and drill. And of course, I will drill this lip right into the table so I can drill straight through. Then I'll flip it over and measure out, mark, and drill the other side. We will then take this back to the float and back drill into the float skin itself. I have reinstalled the rear bottom skin. Notice the flange is now all drilled, and I've also used some clamps to hold it nice and tight against the skin. I'm going to go ahead and back drill the holes into the skin. I'll put a block of wood on the outside of the float against the skin to catch the drill bit as I drill through. I'm going to start at the center and work out both directions so that I try and keep the skin as flat as possible in case there's any excess material, so I can avoid the ripples. There are a lot of clecos. Now, if you don't have enough clecos, you can do this in sections. You don't have to have an entire side done all at once. And then, of course, we can drill in between those. And then we'll go do the other side. When you're all done drilling, you can trace a line above this upper lip. And then when we take this off, we can trim our outer skin down to that line, because ultimately we want this skin and the upper lip to be right at the same level. So when I cut this strip off, I'll cut it a little tall and then file it down to the lip. And I'll do that on both sides, of course. Now that we have the edge flange all drilled in place, we can put our reinforcing gusset in place in this area that we marked off previously with FL35. Thick piece of material, and it's going to go in place right up flush with the edge here. And then our keel, which will run the full length from behind the wheel well, will go over it and on top of it like this. Now, I'll start off first by laying out the rivet lines on here along the edges. And then I can pre-drill it and then put it in place and drill. I did have to trim this to make sure the edge was nice and square and matched up with the front edge here. Obviously, we want these edges to be nice and smooth and line up. We put it in place here. And here I'm laying out the rivet lines. Now check your plans. Mine looked like it was pitch 20, and I started where one of the bulkheads flanges was located. That was my first one. And by the way, notice these lines along here. I put the keel along the top. I'm not going to drill in that area at all because that will go on top. So that limits me at this end, and then pitch 20 across. And this is the rivet line for the most forward bulkhead, stopping at the keel up here. So I'll go ahead and pre-drill this and then go set it on top and drill into the float. Then we'll come back and put the keel along the top and drill that in. Then we can clamp it in place and back drill into the bottom skin through our pre-drilled holes. Now I have placed the keel on top of our gusset, and I've clamped it in place because I now want to mark the bulkhead rivet lines at each bulkhead station all the way down, and then we'll remove this and draw the rivet lines, but this way we'll know that a rivet is to go at each of the bulkhead flanges, and we have it flush at the front. And we'll mark it at the very rear where we'll cut it off as per our plans. And now we'll remove it and take it to the table for drawing the rivet lines and pre-drilling. In drawing out our rivet line on this rear keel, we want to use the bulkhead stations as rivet locations also. So for example, a rivet will go here and here. Now we want to have an even pitch according to our plans, in this case pitch 40. So I'm going to use a rivet fan which I can adjust so that the rivets fall precisely at these points, and that will give me my rivet locations, even though it's a little bit off of the pitch 40, because between each of these bulkhead stations it'll vary a little bit when we get to the next station, etc. And of course we'll have them marked on both sides. I will pre-drill this and then put it back onto the float. And at the back end, we want to cut a piece maybe half the size of our front keel and back riveted in place right here. It's about 2 inches long, and that will offer additional protection when the float runs aground to have this piece on here. I'd say about half that size, whatever your plans call for. With the bottom skin removed, we can now use that line to carefully cut the side skin off. I'm going to use my big shears again, but you can use whatever snips are most comfortable. We want to cut just a little bit outside the line. Remember, this is going to end up being even with the lip of the bottom skin. So if we cut it a little large, we can file it down and make it smooth with the lip. We'll take our time and cut the entire length, both sides. I'm going to install one of the front bottom skins. Now this is exactly the way the part comes from the factory. It will be a little long, but it's easy to size up. We simply put it into place. The lip will go against the side skin, and in the middle the lip will line up even with the flange of bulkhead number 6, and that's how I will adjust it and then clamp it in place. After we have the skin positioned properly from left to right, we then want to take a pen and mark where the skin overhangs the top of the flange, and we'll do that at each flange, and then we can connect the lines. Now we'll end up trimming this piece off, and we don't have to get it absolutely exact because there will be a keel that will fit on top and cover up our cut line. And this piece and then the other piece we put on top won't touch at the center, but they'll come close. At the other end of the skin, we're even with bulkhead number 6. And at the front here, of course, it overhangs and we're going to end up cutting it off. And we're also going to cut out the area for the front wheel. We also want to make sure we have this positioned all the way down and into our side skin. And when we have that just the way we like it with a nice fit, we can then go and trim this far edge. After we've trimmed this piece, we'll set it aside and then go get the other piece that fits on the other side. We are looking at the marks underneath the skin. These were the marks we made right at each bulkhead tip where the skin crossed the bulkhead. It is our job to connect these marks with a smooth line. I'm getting a helper with a steel ruler. There's a slight curve to the line as we connect the dots, and so we'll do the best job we can connecting them with a consistent line. This line doesn't have to be super accurate, as remember, this edge will get covered up by a keel, but we'll do the best job we can. We will then cut this area off. Now this is rather thick aluminum, so we'll have to take our time. It's a little too thick for my scissors shears, so we'll use the conventional snip. And with the heavy aluminum, we want to file off the edges and make them reasonably smooth using our file. And then we'll go back and test fit and confirm that our cut is reasonable and follows along the corners of each of the bulkheads. We're going to repeat this operation for the other side, and remember, we don't want the two edges to be touching at the center. Now we're going to trace along the edge of the front nose wheel well. We're going to leave the length in place, so we're not going to shorten this at the moment, but we will make a cut and then up to the front of the second bulkhead. And then we can proceed to the other half of the bottom front skin. And here's the cutout for the front nose wheel. I simply traced it underneath while the skin was on and cut it a little bit larger, went back and checked the fit, and then came back and did the final cut, and also notice the radius in the corner. Do that with a round rat tail file because we don't want a sharp point when we have an inside corner like that. We want it rounded so we don't develop any cracks. And of course I used a file like this one to clean all the edges off because we want to make sure those are smooth. Again, to prevent cracks from forming and from cutting your hands. And here's the rat tail file used on getting the corner. Here's our skin installed. Now our next step is to draw the flange lines of each bulkhead like we did on the rear skin on the front skin. I'll use a square, and it's a lot easier to confirm we have the line properly because we can actually see the flange this time with our two-piece bottom skin. With both sides of the bottom skin on, the keel is put into place down the center in order that we can trace the outline of the keel, because this will be a no rivet zone when we mark the rivets for the flanges of the bulkhead. With the front bottom skin all marked, we are ready to pre-drill our holes. Now we have the area where the keel is going to sit, and that's marked so that we can do our spacing so that it doesn't interfere with the edge of the keel. And then down on the edge, we have that marked also with the proper pitch. Now that we have finished the drilling, we can go mount this back on the bottom of the float. After we can see the line on each of the bulkhead flanges through our pre-drilled holes, and we have everything clamped in place, and this edge lines up flush with the bulkhead flange, we can go ahead then and drill through the holes. And we're drilling both the bulkhead flanges and the edge flange. Then we will trace along the edge so we can remove the metal above, so that our skin is then flush with the top edge of the bottom skin. And we will repeat for the other side. After we have both halves of the forward bottom skin in place and the side flange drilled also, we want to place the forward keel along the edge, and the first thing we'll notice is that the keel comes straight, so we will need to gently bend it into a bit of a curve so that it's a little easier to work with. And then we'll lay out the rivet line with the proper pitch and then place back on the float bottom. Here we have the keel pre-bent so that it roughly follows the contour. Not exactly, but roughly. And that'll make it much easier to rivet in place. Notice also that we have marked on the keel the bulkhead rivet locations. Now this is important so that when we lay out the rivet pitch on the keel, we hit each of the bulkhead flanges underneath. So we will adjust our spacing appropriately. The keel begins flush with the edge of the bulkhead. We will remove this now and lay out our rivet line.
This is a great tool for drawing center lines.
It's available from your aircraft supply houses, and you simply insert a pen of your choice, set the tab, and it will allow you to draw very accurate lines along edges of the components. We use it for marking our rivet locations. Float construction continues on Disc 2.